Welcome to Talking Tuesday. I am your host, Fancy Quant, and today I'd like to welcome a personal friend and author of Mainline Business Cycle Theory, C.R. Olschwang. Today we're going to discuss the difference between mainline and mainstream economics. So without further ado, let's dive on in. Okay, so for those of you that don't know, CR, we actually know each other from you going to school at UTD. You were a finance major, business major?
Yeah, I was a finance major.
Okay. And so I presented up at UTD a few times. We had some coffee chats, discussed finance, business, economics, and all that. I'll try to put a picture on here as well if I can find it. There is a picture of us. So most people don't realize I am quite short. I'm like 5'5", and you are quite tall. You are what, 6?
6 foot 6'1", something like that.
Okay. So there's this really funny picture I'll try to put on here for anyone on the YouTube channel, because I had it on my phone a few weeks ago. I was looking through the pictures. And it's like, you're like giant, and then you have me, and I'm like super short kind of in there. But yeah, so the camera doesn't do justice on that, on the differences there. But anyway, so you reached out to me. We've communicated over the last few years. You wrote a book now called Mainline Economics. What's the title of the book?
Mainline Business Cycle Theory.
Okay, interesting. So can you just explain what is mainline economics here? Because for me, this is kind of interesting in the fact that when I went through grad school or undergrad, and even graduate school, business cycles seemed like this dead theory and nobody talked about it. And it was like, I've told people this and they go, oh no, they still teach it in schools. But most main economic programs have gotten away from teaching business cycles. And then of course, one of my favorite authors is Fisher Black, the famous economist and finance guru. And he has an entire book on business cycles as well. And yet when you read a lot of those books as well, you start to find out these people are like ostracized as like, you're an old man and you don't do things right. So you want to talk a little bit about like, what is mainline economics and what is the book about?
Yeah, so what mainline economics is it was a term that I believe was coined by Peter Botecki, who's an economist at George Mason University. And the high level idea of it was to create a distinct tradition of economics, distinguishing those who follow in these steps of Adam Smith versus those who kind of break from it, right? Because what we've had in economics is ever since Adam Smith, there were people who kind of followed in steps like Alfred Marshall, Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, John Bates Clark, all of those that kind of followed and just built on what he initially established, right? However, there's been those like institutional economics and Keynesian economics that break from what Adam Smith originally built in some very significant ways. And so what I wanted to do was to take business cycle theory, right? Which if you don't know, it's like all macroeconomics class that I'll teach today are just Keynesian economics, right? With some extra asterisks added on, right?
Yeah, don't tell people though, because they don't know that. They think think it's a whole new thing. And we can talk about that later, but yeah, the whole distinguishing of micro and macro, I think, is very odd.
Yes.
Like how do you have a model that doesn't add up? Like if everyone's making the same decision, when you add them together, you should get the same decision.
Yes, exactly. And so that's what I was trying to do. So there are 3 business cycle theories that are not Keynesian in nature. And what that means is the Keynesian theories embrace something called Keynes' law. And that is the inverse of Say's law, which Say's law says that supply constitutes demand. And all that means in practice is that markets will equilibrate, right? It has some other implications, but high level, it just means markets will equilibrate. And Keynesians do not believe that markets will equilibrate on the aggregate, usually because investment is insufficient. And so what I wanted to do is take the theories that actually operated off Say's law and make them into one theory that has greater predictive power than any one of them has individually. Because one of the problem with these theories is they take time sets and then they just be like, okay, during this time period, my theory works really well. And they'll ignore all other time periods, right? And I'm like, well, no duh, I can also do that. Because, if you torture data enough, you can get any result you want. And what I wanted to do was create a theory that could consistently explain the data all the way from 1920 to 2020. If you can't explain every crisis and get to a sufficient magnitude as well as explain the longevity of it, it's not a good theory. And so my work primarily just takes these differing theories, tries to put them together into one coherent one, and provides an explanation for all of the crises between 1920 and 2020.
Okay. And I think one of the important little notes here that maybe many viewers don't realize, when you were throwing out names at the beginning of those that we would consider somewhat that follow Adam Smith, you threw out
Yeah.
people like Milton Friedman, who's viewed as like
Yeah.
a classical or neoclassical.
Yeah.
Uh, and then you also threw out people like F.A. Hayek, who's viewed as an Austrian.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people have forgotten the fact that, yes, these are all different schools of thought, but many of these all still align with the original principles of Adam Smith.
Yeah, they're just different interpretations on the original principles, right? So the kind of Milton Friedman Chicago school approach, right, is very quantitative. It focuses on models. They simplify a lot more, right? And the Austrian approach kind of moves away from those models, tends to prefer verbal deduction, tends to prefer less specific rigorous models. And the reason is because they think it makes their models less accurate, right? And the Chicago school retort is that, well, we don't care about how realistic our models are, we care how well they predict the outcome, right? And that kind of creates a conflict. But ultimately, this is kind of like one of those things where you have two people that are near identical arguing over minor points, right? Because to anyone that's outside the debate, they'll be like, I thought you guys believed the same thing.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, I think this is a good point, because I think a lot of this too comes from the fact of how I would view it, which is the political divide between it. So people look at me
Yes.
politically and they say, you seem really conservative. And I'm like, I'm libertarian. So I sit in this weird realm of I'm not left, I'm not right. And it aligns, like, I guess, economically with Austrian economics in the sense that, it's how do you maximize freedoms? How do you follow basic economics, things that kind of stem from that Adam Smith approach. But then I think when you start to deviate with Keynesian, and even if you want to go into political realms of this, if you go into socialism or you go into communism, you start to realize that we're all still studying economics, but now you have to deviate in the fact that somebody believes in full control and power and planning and central planning. And central planning is what really distinguishes the separation between those two. But I think your point is excellent in the fact that people don't realize all of us in the capitalistic realm, we're all arguing and fighting, thinking we're like different schools of thought, but we're all stemming from one root. And yet often I think when we argue with Keynesian, we don't realize we're not even on the same agreements of how the rules are set, because they have the ideology that central planning and market manipulation is what's going to drive that production.
Exactly. So that's something that's driven me nuts, right? So I was trained as both a neoclassical and an Austrian economist by two different professors. And so I kind of got a background to both. And I was like, you guys disagree a lot, but it sounds all like you're on the same side, right? And so what happens really is here's, I think, the fundamental distinction between what makes someone a mainline and a mainstream economist. A mainstream economist says markets fail, let's use government, right? And a mainline economist says markets fail, we acknowledge that, right? The question is, will government do a better job? And we do not take that as an implicit yes, right? And so prior to James Buchanan and public choice theory, the kind of implicit assumption was if markets fail, you could just assume government will do the right thing. It will intervene. It will execute the policy correctly, right? And I am very skeptical of that. And the reason I'm skeptical of that is that's not consistent with economics. And there's a very easy way you can prove this. Government actors and market actors are drawn from the exact same population. So anything you'd expect a market actor to do, you'd also expect a government actor to do. So if we believe market actors are going to act in their self-interest, there's no reason we should treat politicians as if they're somehow less self-interested and purely benevolent, right? And if we believe market actors are limited in knowledge, as we all accept that they are, then you have to accept that government actors are. And so you end up with a question not of the individuals constituting each institution, but instead the institutional incentives that they are operating under. And really, I think the question of how far you want government to intervene in an economy to make it better is a question of how much you trust government in any particular instance and under particular institutions relative to the market institutions you're facing. And I think that sort of comparative analysis is a more objective approach than just assuming one institution will do the right thing.
Right. And I think a good point on that too is understanding the imbalance of power. So the difference between market participants and government participants is that the way I like to view market participants is you have a bunch of people with this like big rope, and it's like a big spider web, and everybody is in there with their piece of rope and everyone's pulling in their own direction. And so often the market doesn't move a lot because everybody wants their own best interest. And so it kind of has this stable position where it's not going crazy one way or another way. Where when you look at government, the problem is they have all the power. So it's like, me trying to play tug of war with like a bear or an elephant. Like literally all it does is just walks away and everybody has to follow that because there's such an imbalance between market participants and government rules and regulations.
Exactly. Here's the point I always like to make, right? In a market, if one person messes up, the whole market's not going to come down, right? No one really ever in an open market accrues enough power to be able to take down the whole market if their business fails, right? Even in the financial crisis, right, which that was partially brought about by government, right? What happened is you have these concentrated banks, but it's not one bank that failed that took down the market. It was a lot of banks, and it was the same with the Great Depression, right? In government, if one person makes a mistake, everyone goes down, right? Because the amount of power that government possesses and the amount of control it has over the economy gives it a sort of disproportionate say, which in theory doesn't sound bad for as long as it's wielded well. The question is, will it be wielded well? And as an economist, we tend to almost implicitly assume a sort of behavioral egalitarianism in that we treat all people as acting under a very broad framework of value maximizing. And so if you treat people in that sort of egalitarian framework, then you have no reason to believe that if you just give less people power, it's going to become better.
Yeah. Yeah. I think another important little note in the way that you framed it too is that the Mainline is more interested in government's not the first jump to conclusion, but it's also not the knee-jerk reaction of government bad, which I think a lot of people jump to. It's how do we look at the problem analytically? So whether you're using data models like a classical economist, or you're using more theoretical things like an Austrian economist, but trying to figure out, is this a problem that we can solve with markets? Or is it one of those rare cases where it's like we need to somehow have government distribute these? And so when I was taught and educated, I had a professor that absolutely hated all the textbooks, did everything himself, wrote all his own materials. And one of the things he kept emphasizing in class was that markets are great, markets are excellent, but government's not always bad. And so for me, that was shockingly different from the traditional thought line where it's like you have a lot of people that are the knee-jerk reaction of government's bad. And then you have the other line, which is government fixes everything. And so when he would give examples, one of them is like streets. When you have shared streets, how do you charge every user for that street? Because you'd want to charge everyone based on usage. So if you use the street, 1 million times a year and I use it twice, I shouldn't pay the same cost. But back when I was taking classes before technologies came about, it wasn't a very practical thing to privatize. And it makes sense that you're going to need some sort of government to put some sort of pricing system in place, to maintain the roads, to collect taxes. And I think there's always a small portion of problems like that. But I would argue now too with technology. So I live in Texas now. You've been in Texas. The tolls here are like light years ahead of anything in the Northeast. Like you just drive. There's no stopping. There's no putting money in a toll box. And the toll roads are stellar. Like I moved here and I'd never been on toll roads. And I was complaining constantly, like, I have this stupid toll road. I have to pay for it. It's, the North Dallas Tollway. And so I was like, I'm going to drive to 75 and I'm going to go south on 75 and go all the way around. And I'm going to go downtown and save myself that, $3 or whatever. And then I realized it takes me an extra hour and a half or something on top of the normal commute just to get there. And so I think part of this too is like what we're talking about is government can often be a solution where it's needed. But as technology advances a lot of times and markets become more dynamic, things actually start getting replaced over time too, where I look at the toll roads now and I'm like, I'm so glad they're privatized. And I am more than happy to pay the fee to use the toll because it saves me gas and time, which I would not have had otherwise.
Yeah, and it also matters the institutions of a society, right? That's something that I think is important that many people don't focus on enough, which Adam Smith did draw a lot of attention to in The Wealth of Nations, which is some societies may work better with more government and some may work better with less government. And what I mean by that is not that some societies are like, oh, they're just not democratic or anything like that.
Yeah.
But the idea is that if you have a different history, then that different history manifests in institutions. So this is what I call institutional feedback. So if you have a history of certain institutions, what happens is your culture your culture kind of adapts to those institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then by adapting to those institutions, then it constrains your future institutional possibilities, right? So for example, in Russia, when they transitioned from communism to capitalism, right, it didn't become drastically less corrupt as it has elsewhere, right? Because they've had communism for a very long time at that point. And so that's the model they were used to. And so when they started selling off state enterprises, when they started doing this, it ended up just being as corrupt and just as power concentrated as before, right? Because the institutions of the past kind of predetermined their future point, right? And in the book by Darren Acemoglu, the name of it, Why Nations Fail, that's what it is. He kind of talks about path dependence, right? Which is if you have a history of institutions, it kind of will constrain where you can go in the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that will mean for different nation states, for different cities, for different levels of analysis, there may be different amounts of government and different amounts of markets that you may need, right? And while we can all agree that there's probably some band where it's reasonable to restrict it to, we can't be like absolutist and just be like, oh, well, we can just protect these three rights and everything can just be left to the market, right?
Yeah.
And that's something I've kind of tried to stress, right? Because a lot of times people solve things naturally. So prior to the implementation of the welfare state, we had a fairly robust private charity network in the United States, right? And the United States still to this day remains the most charitable country in the world. And so that's a very big cultural difference versus many other nations which have trust issues, which have just lower social trust overall, that do not necessarily have cultures due to past institutions, usually abusive governments, that kind of degrade the kind of communities that they have, right? Which may need a welfare state to kind of step in to provide that charity because people will not do it voluntarily, right? And I think that's where the comparative institutional analysis comes in, which is often lacking in modern neoclassical economics as well as Keynesian economics.
Do you think though that part of that comes from, I'm going to say DTI, but I have to think about it, disposable income? In
Yeah.
the sense that in the United States we have just so much more prosperity, which most people don't fully comprehend. When you start thinking about the rest of the world, like I remember looking at a stat like 5-10 years ago, and it was like the average living standard of someone in China is like the same as Honduras.
Yes.
And we don't think that way. And I've talked to colleagues that are from China, and they're like, "Oh yeah, if you go to visit, it's amazing, it's beautiful, but only go to Beijing, only go to Shanghai. Don't go to the insides." And I'm like, "But I want to go see like the countryside. I want to see like the country." And they're like, "Yeah, it's not what you think it is." But I think the charity piece, I think that's being driven from the fact that Americans have so much excessive wealth. Like we think, for example, I have a smartphone. People think like a smartphone is like a necessity. You have to have this.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you go around to a lot of parts of the world and they might not have a smartphone or they might not have internet in a lot of these third world countries. But I think a lot of that charity is probably driven, don't you think, by the fact that the United States just has so much more excess wealth because of the system we're currently in?
Yes, exactly. So one thing that we know in economics, and there's been several really good studies that have confirmed this, is that as societies get wealthier, what happens is economics is you move down a value scale, right? So kind of like high level economics, people have things they value, and you can think of it as almost like a ladder, right? And each rung of the ladder is something they value. There's one at the very top, one at the very bottom. It's almost like a hierarchy of wants, right?
I think it's called Maslow's
Yeah,
hierarchy.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
I purposely did not use the word needs because as economists we deal with utility, we deal with value, we deal with preferences, right? And needs very difficult to define in a world where value is marginal, right? Because need must not be marginal by definition. But anyway, people have like a series of wants, right? And as you kind of meet the more basic ones in sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? As you meet kind of food security, as you meet stable housing, all that other stuff, right? People will start caring about other values because now they no longer have to worry about that, right? So one thing that we know is people's care for climate change is directly proportional to how wealthy the country is, right? So if you go to like a country like Africa and you say, hey, we're going to have to like put a tax on carbon to prevent you guys from polluting the environment, that would have a huge uproar because for many of them, right, they're concerned about providing food for their families. They're concerned about maintaining stable shelter. They're concerned about protecting themselves and their families from not only starvation, but potential violence from some parts of Africa where there's more criminal elements, right? And that's a way more pressing concern to them than rising a few degrees Celsius in 100 years, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really like, as societies get wealthier, they don't have to worry about those things anymore, and they can start caring about climate change, which is why when you see like commitments to ESG, it's always in the developed wealthy countries, and it's never in the emerging markets, which don't want to have to do with it at all, right?
Yeah. Well, ESG. ESG drives me nuts in the sense that, one, the people that push ESG I notice the most are the least environmental friendly.
Mhm.
So like people like criticize me. They say, "Oh, Dimitri, you hate environmentalism, you hate this, you hate that." I go, "You realize I garden organically. I grow a ton of food every year.
Mhm.
I just don't like go out there and tell people like you should grow organic and you should do whatever, because I know it's like a luxury. Like
Yeah.
growing food mass scale on an economic scale to feed all these people isn't feasible." And then the other piece with it too is, you're right, like it's the developed countries that have all those basic needs met. So they can sit and worry about these problems that are really insignificant to the rest of the world, who are more concerned about, can I eat tomorrow? Because if I don't eat
Yes.
tomorrow, I might die. Where you're concerned with like, well, I think the world's going to end in 5 years, which we keep saying every year. And magically now we're like 30, 40 years down the road and we're still doing fine. We're still plugging along. Um, and yet people don't seem to connect those dots economically. I think like how the rest of the world functions. We all
Mhm.
like to think in our bubble of, especially Americans or Europeans, like we're in
Yes.
this bubble where it's like the only thing that matters is us, and we don't realize that everybody else needs in a way to survive, and they just don't have the luxuries that we have.
Yeah, that's something I've always tried to point out. So, what is considered poor here is considered middle class in Europe and is considered rich in many emerging markets, right? I've Trust me, I've been to many of them. I can tell you it's rich, right? And many studies have confirmed this. And so the real question with ESG, right, is even if you agree with all the values that they profess, because I agree with basically all of them, even though I think they're very poorly defined, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, is it really effective, right? And how can you really measure it? And I don't think either of those have ever been sufficiently answered, right? Because one problem is Bastiat, one of those economists who falls in the tradition of Adam Smith, right, once made the distinction between the seen consequences of our actions and the unseen consequences of our
Mm-hmm.
actions. And the problem is the unseen is way greater than the seen. And for many things like ESG, it is often difficult for us in a complex society full of diverse people with very differing circumstances to pursue conscious good with a single central plan for everyone, because every person's different. Everyone finds themselves in a different circumstance, right? So maybe by pushing more clean forms of energy and impoverishing cheaper forms of energy, we might actually make climate change worse for the countries that are the ones that are the number one polluters. I think last time I checked, China is the top polluter in the world. And if China's the top polluter, if we prevent China from becoming richer, right, what's going to
Mm-hmm.
make them go green?
Yeah. And the China thing always bugs me, because it's one of those things that's harder to nail down. Like you're talking about, the numbers are harder to nail down than people think. Like
Mm-hmm.
everyone thinks if you run out there and you just measure something and like, oh, it's 12 inches. Like, of course that's
Yeah.
what it is. But like China's the biggest loophole for the West, in the sense that all of the stuff that we're consuming, at least a large portion of this, is
Mm-hmm.
coming from China. So China, produces the CO2, the pollutants, heavy metals, battery processing, all kinds of, puts iPhones together. So they have this massive tax essentially of ESG, where it's like, yeah, they're a terrible country and they're, polluting like crazy. But the reality is all that pollutants is really based on the demand for those goods in Europe and in the US and other countries, where it's like, I want those goods and I don't want that ESG bad score. So can you
Yes.
absorb those credits for me, and then we'll purchase them all, like purchase the goods and pretend like we're like, I don't know, excellent angels. Like I think the ESG community as a whole doesn't realize that. Like the people that are buying all the junk, the luxury cars, the houses, the iPhones, and the high-end computers and 15 million tablets all your kids have, like you're literally just contributing to that by adding to that toxicity of performance here with environmental issues with China themselves. And also with Africa, because I also wanted to know, I found out Europe just dumps all their, biohazards just in Africa.
Yes.
Like it's just a dumping ground.
Which that in itself seems like a big issue that they should be addressing, but no one cares about that because it's not the number one issue for Western people who benefit from it.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing I always find, right, is that you can never find a definition of ES and G that anyone will agree upon. what environmental metrics? There's a lot. For example, one thing you won't hear people talk about is biodiversity. But even if we like ignore biodiversity, right? There's about 10,000 other metrics other than just carbon output that negatively impact our environment that you would have to adequately take account of. Because by pursuing one metric, you might make the other ones worse, right? And the same's for social, right? Even if social is defined as diversity of what? Identity, thought, viewpoint. There's a lot of diversity that you can have, right? You can even have just diversity of appearance or dress or speaking style, and which one is the diversity that matters, right? And governance is so undefined that I've never actually heard anyone, and I attend a lot of these ESG calls, where that actually gives a definition that is usable. They often give such an abstract definition that it functionally is meaningless, right? And the issue I find with all this, right, is not only can you not define it very well, but also if you try to measure ESG, right, where do you stop that measurement, right? Do you stop it at what the company directly produces at their headquarters, right? Do you do their factories? Do you do through their whole supply chain, right? Or do you even do back through their whole supply chain all the way to all the miners and all the other stuff, right? And the question is, there is no stopping point and there's no arbitrary line you can draw. However, how do you really assess that and account for all the relevant metrics, right? And even if all of that is ignored, right, there's a really severe issue in my view of assessing it, right? Because do you assess it on an absolute or a relative basis? And if you're doing it on a relative basis, relative to all investable companies, or relative to the industry, or relative to the sub-industry, right? And there's, again, no good line. All of these will ultimately become arbitrary lines. And there's not any evidence that even if we were to draw arbitrary lines, we could find which one is the most effective because there's so many metrics we'd have to track.
Yeah. And a weird thing. So the regulators pushed out to the banks. They wanted them, from a banking perspective, they wanted them to track one step away. So kind of getting to your point, how many steps do you go down this rabbit hole? And they wanted to say, okay, anyone that you make a loan to, you need to calculate and track all their ESG. And I'm looking at it like, this is so infeasible because I get like if a bank makes a loan to another big corporation and that big corporation has a whole ESG department, and they're spending excessive amounts of economic resources on this wasteful, goose chase of trying to measure things. But then at the same time, now if you have a bank doing all these small mom and pop shop loans, which again, if you want to look at people that are typically for ESG, they're typically left leaning and they want, to help small businesses and the underdog and all that. And of course, when you do that, so who's going to measure all their ESG? Now you're requiring a bank to hire an entire staff to measure the ESG of firms that might be local or other parts of the country. And now you'd have to send out like auditors and people to collect data. And like nobody realizes the cost benefit analysis is so skewed that the costs are so high and the benefits are, marginal, if even exist, because people are just debating on, like you're talking about, so how do you define it? And what's the outcome of it? And then people go, okay, well, we need to hire more people to do more research to come up with a better strategy. And I'm just like, why can we just not just leave this as it is? And let's go back. And I think this is where I'm probably getting with a lot of this. A lot of the economics now has been muddied up purely by politics. ESG is nothing more than a political campaign. So even people that enjoy the environment, who are outdoorsy people, are against ESG in a lot of ways, in the sense that I just want to go outside. I just want to have a clean environment. We have rules and regulations with the EPA and everything now. We don't need to like make government bigger and bigger. And at the end of the day, right, we're not looking at all the externalities. It's a very economic term. All these negative consequences of making a decision. And yet we have tons of people in the political spectrum who are lobbying and coming up with really skewed research, I'll put in air quotes here, these analyses. And now they have all these, so GARP, the Global Association for Risk Professionals, I think has gone off the rails and now has a whole environmental certificate that you can get. And I'm just scratching my head like, we can't figure out how to do modeling correctly in the banks. And I'm arguing like simple tasks, like coming back to economics 101. And we're worried about something that's not measurable, that's hard to define, that no one agrees on, and we don't know the benefits of it, but we're going to keep dumping more resources in it.
Yeah, that's something I've always tried to stress in economics, right? I think Friedrich Hayek actually made this point really well in, unfortunately, a book that was published posthumously, right? Called The Fatal Conceit. And in the book, he basically argues that we kind of have to live in two systems simultaneously, right? We have to live in the system of the family, right? And when it comes to the family, we're functionally all socialists, right? We don't, marginally cost. Like, I'm not like to my kid, yeah, I see you ate that much food. I'm going to charge you for that, right? We just kind of agree to equally distribute resources, find some way of breaking up the workload. Maybe the kids do some chores. Maybe the parents do some chores. They have to do their homework, except as Adam Smith pointed out in The Wealth of Nations, that doesn't scale, right? Because the thing is, in a market order, what goes into making like a pencil, right, as the classic example goes, involves so many countless people, involves millions of people across the globe, none of which you can be all friends with, right? You might know the name of one of them, but you need to make use of the services of countless people you don't know. And this is kind of the extended order in which we exist, right? However, what works really well on the family, right? If you extend it up to this kind of extended order, if you extend it up to the market order, it will not work, because we don't know the circumstances of everything, because we don't know the results, because the results are so far removed from our action, right, that we can never produce the results we intended, right? So it's often better to use a sense of humility or prudence, right, to kind of do your job within the market, and then in your own personal capacity, give to charity, pursue these causes, right? Because they'll often produce a better outcome instead of trying to make a categorical decision for countless diverse people.
I think that you're hitting on one of the key points, which is what we talked about a little bit with the charity piece. I think it's also why religion has been a key component of the United States. So a lot of people, I don't know, wave their hands and say, oh yeah, there's one religion or whatever, but they fail to realize the United States was like all these people that were ostracized in all these other countries, and they wanted, to have different religious views, all came to the United States. And yet when you look at religion and you look at charity and everything, as people do better and better and better, often those driving forces of charity, what Adam Smith would probably argue is the invisible hand, it's taking care of these things. And you think, okay, people are going to maximize, they're going to think everybody's bad, they're not going to help anybody. And yet we see that invisible hand theorem, which is like the markets will balance and people will give to charity. And I think religion plays a critical piece in the cultural fabric of it teaches those, thousands of year old lessons that it's hard to see. Like invisible hand, I think is one of those principles. Like it makes no sense. And you tell people like, no. If everyone does what's best for them, everyone will do better. And then everybody comes up with like an anecdotal story of like, well, this one person in this one scenario got screwed. But they don't realize on a cultural framework, you need a religious aspect. So a balance of religions is kind of works like in a market. You have all these different ideologies floating. And then you also have the need for the family structure in the sense that you have some sort of stability that pushes a society into a stable framework. Like you're taking little miniature humans that have kids now, and you watch them learn the dumbest things. Like, how do you not know how to use a pencil? You just pick up the pencil and you just write with it. And yet these simple things are like, you need that, I don't know, family kind of structure to help protect you and get you to the point where you can fend for yourself in an economy. And then you can kind of operate in this system where it's like everyone's actually benefiting from the decisions of everybody else.
Exactly. I think you hit on a really key point. One thing I've really tried to bring back into economics, and I'm doing this with my book and I'm doing it with all the future books I try to do, is, again, as I mentioned, institutional analysis. And I think religion plays a key role in that, because the way I view it, right, is there's Edmund Burke and Friedrich Hayek, and they probably said it the best, right, is there are certain practices that have evolved over time, and they have demonstrated their usefulness by the fact that they've lasted so long. And often these practices play an essential role, not only in the functioning of a market, but in the functioning of our communities and our families and our government, right? The notion of individual rights that anyone irrelevant of the political spectrum values to some degree, right? Is an evolved notion. We didn't just somehow like one day just come up with pure, like, it wasn't like a message from God, right? All these rights, you can actually trace the legal histories going back very far, right? And Hayek does that, and so does Edmund Burke, right? And all these rights, fundamentally, we use them as proxies, not because we are certain that we have these sort of abstract rights, but because they have shown to be more useful than the alternative by the fact that they have lasted so long. And so I've tried to kind of bring a sort of what I call a sort of historical consequentialism, kind of recognizing that historical events are not necessarily just random fragments of different eras, and we should not connect things, but also see that maybe institutions that have survived have value, and we shouldn't necessarily treat society as if we can restart it from day zero, as if
Yeah.
nothing had happened prior.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's important too for listeners to know, because I don't know if they all realize, The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776.
Yes.
So this book is old. This isn't like, something came out like the 50s and 60s. This is essentially before the United States started, this book came out and laid all these foundations. And one takeaway I had when I read the book is I was just so shocked at like how many of those principles still are fundamentally like the framework of economics. And some
Yes.
guy with essentially no technology in 1776 can look at all this data and all this information and look at societies and figure all this out and then put it into this massive book. So if you have like the
Yeah.
real, I have like the original ones, like the, the
Yeah.
4-inch book that's the little tiny one that's all written in British English and it's challenging to read. But yeah, so these are old principles that have endured time. And I've read part of it, I haven't read the whole book, but Adam Smith has another book on, I think it's The Sentiment of Morals, something
The
like
theory
that.
of moral sentiments. Yes.
Yes. And so he's touching, I think, on similar things as well. Like economics is more than just like, I get money, so I do better, which I
Mhm.
think is how a lot of people in general view economics these days.
Mhm.
They don't view it as like, we're trying to make everything better for everybody, but often the actual solutions are counterintuitive to what you would think
Yes.
because humans are just, we can't comprehend. Like things are too complicated, so you can't take in every factor possible. And I think that's the beauty of capitalism and open markets, in the sense that capitalism is nothing more than two people agreeing to some sort of deal freely with no coercion, no limitation. It's just I agree that I want something from you, and you're willing to give that to me for some sort of trade there.
Exactly. It's sort of like what I always say is the institutions that we have, at least the ones that were not designed, but the ones that are the product of years of evolution that have kind of tested that they clearly work well, right? Tend to help us cope with the lack of information we have. Because one thing Adam Smith points out very early on in The Wealth of Nations is as the division of labor expands, the less each individual knows of the whole knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, at one point, right, when we knew very little is possible for someone to know most of the knowledge of society, right? With cavemen, there's only a handful of things. There's
Yeah.
spears, there's fires, there's killing things, right? Pretty easy stuff to learn, right? But now if you look at all the technology you use, all the stuff you rely on, most people can't tell you how they work, right?
Yeah.
I'm having a problem with my heater, right, from my shower. I can't tell you how that works. I have to bring out a technician to come help me, right? And many people see that as some sort of defect, but no, that's to our great advantage, right? Because as we divide knowledge, you have this benefit where you can have more total societal knowledge, because there's two factors at play. One is as individuals specialize, they will create more knowledge in the disciplines they specialize in,
Mm-hmm.
which then expands societal knowledge. But also, the less people know of the same thing, the more we have total knowledge, because the less replication you have, right? So if you think of society as a sort of collective memory, if we have everyone know 100% of the same things, we have barely any knowledge. But as individuals diversify their knowledge, we can make use of more knowledge than any individual or group possesses, even though it seems like we're all more relatively ignorant of the order in which we operate. And I don't think people understand this, because I think the fundamental fallacy of kind of socialism is that they believe that knowledge can be treated as either given, or that our reason can somehow answer the fundamental questions of society. But more often than not, experience is a much better guide to knowing things than our reason. Because as Jonathan Haidt pointed out in his book, The Righteous Mind, and Jonathan Haidt's kind of a moral psychologist, he wrote in the book that people have intuitions first about what they think the right answer to a question is, and then they work backwards with their reason to justify it, right? People
Yes.
post hoc justify, right? And why I've always kind of stressed the importance of positive economics, which is the empirical side of economics, right? Excluding all morals from it, is that if you're not forced to challenge your beliefs with evidence, right, you
Mm-hmm.
can reach any belief you want. Trust me, you can come up with a theory.
Yes. Yeah, it's insanity in a lot of ways. I've been debating with people on this lately, on the specialization piece of it. We've been talking about, so the question keeps coming up of, are we over specialized? And I am starting to swing to the other side of, I think we have come to the point where we are over specializing to the point that people are so dependent on everybody else that when one piece goes down, we might have worse outcomes. So trying to now justify this empirically, right? Because I can't just, I have an opinion. It's an opinion. I don't have fact, I don't have data for this. But then trying to do essentially the other problem I've been debating with quantitative finance, which is where I completely deviate, which is the whole idea of utility. So I've had two, I would say, well-known figures in quantitative finance have came out with a statement that utility functions are stupid and we should not learn them because we can't model them. And my argument is actually the opposite. My argument is you can't model utility functions because utility functions are far too complex, but utility functions represent in modeling framework the risk. Because we all know models are wrong. Every model we make for economics is wrong, which is where Keynesians and classical often get off the rails a little bit too much. And Austrians get criticized because they're not using enough math and modeling. But I think the point with it is that if we understand in a utility function, like what makes me happy is really weird things that don't make other people happy. And so in economics, we want to draw that simple line, like, how do I maximize this function? Dimitri, tell me the 100 things that make you happy. We'll put it into a function and we'll maximize it. And I think this is where we're failing in quantitative finances. It's like, if I can't model it, then I just ignore it. But that's the risk piece here, because we all know in finance, all the equations they teach you in a business degree are useless. Time value of money is just a generalized concept. And yet I see people teaching like Black-Scholes and they think like this model is going to fix how things are done with like option pricing. And then you get into the real world and you go, oh, it's a nice framework and we'll kind of stick to it, but we're going to create all of our own models for, you know, broken assumptions left and right. And so I think quantitative finance as a whole is missing that ideological kind of theology piece that maximizing utility is a very theoretical thing. So I can't mathematically tell you what your function is. You can't tell me what your function is. And I'm sure that changes across time. But at the same time, utility is a very important concept, and that markets, I think this is where markets come in a dynamic fashion here, is that markets will adjust to the supply and demand of goods and needs and wants. And so my weird obsession with like citrus trees, for example, makes me extremely happy that I bought a calamundan tree. But at the end of the day, most people are like, what the hell's a calamundan? Why do I want a dumb tree? And I'm gonna have to take care of this thing, and it makes you unhappy. And so I think from a quantitative finance modeling perspective here, I think the theoretical part often gets overlooked in the seeking for mathematics. And I think in many ways economics as a whole has failed in the sense that we are trying to optimize everything, but we fail to realize most humans' maximum for utility is actually a balance.
Yeah, I have an issue with even the term utility. I try to avoid it to the best of my knowledge, because utility derives from utilitarianism, and it often presumes that people are trying to maximize happiness. But I always argue that there are things that people value that don't make them happy in like a hedonic sense, but give them meaning. And that would also account for on the value scale, right? So I try to say value maximizing, welfare maximizing, but I fundamentally agree with you, right? Which is that just because something is theoretical does not mean it's not useful. And so this is a point Milton Friedman made that I think is correct, which is that all models are wrong, but some models are useful, right? And what that means is that a model really is not assessed by its realism, because no model is realistic. Like theoretically, if you try to make a model of perfectly realistic human action, I dare you, because most people who are married to someone for decades can't tell you everything about them, right? Because people are just so complex, right? And people are so diverse that you can't create a realistic model of human action. But that doesn't mean you can't create predictions or a model for predictions that are useful, because what is the alternative? Guessing? I feel like a model would be better, right? And so because a model is useful, we determine models not by their realism, but their predictive power. And this applies in every discipline, right? In physics, we've never actually measured the one-way speed of light. This is a fact most people don't know. We've only measured the two-way speed of light. We assume it is symmetrical, right? Not because we know it is, but because it happens to be useful. Once the physics breaks around that, we'll probably change that. But until that happens, it's a useful assumption. And the same is true of chemistry. Sometimes you'll do everything right to cause a reaction and it just won't happen. And we can't say why, but that doesn't mean that we should just throw out all chemistry models and just go back to throwing things together and hoping something happens, right? It just means we need to optimize our models. These models are just intended to help us abstract key features of reality because reality is too complex for our minds to deal with, and then help us make predictions about the future such that the model can be useful guides to our actions. And the key here when it comes to utility functions, right, is even though we can't measure them, they are very useful in theory and help building out these models. Because even if we can't directly measure them, we can derive theories based on them, such as supply and demand, which demand implies a utility function, that do happen to be useful, right? Because then we can create a model of supply and that's if this goes up, then we'll expect this to happen, right? And if that does happen, that at least lends credence to the underlying theory, even if we cannot directly test it. Because just because something cannot be directly tested doesn't mean it is not valuable. And that's something I really struggle with when I talk to, like, as you say, like quantitative people, right? Because they will often say, well, if we can't directly test it, it has no value, right? But often a model is useful not because you can directly test it, but because it works.
Right. And I think the important piece, which I don't feel quantitative finance is teaching very well, or economics, is that understanding you have a missing piece is the most critical piece of using the model. Because you know the risk that's tied to that. And I think, unfortunately, we make a lot of political decisions and financial decisions based off of, I have this model and it predicts X, so therefore it's a good decision. Where sometimes you have a theoretical argument that's like, okay, that is the prediction, but we know on average we're going to underpredict or overpredict, or maybe the model's not good because I know that you're missing that critical piece.
Yes, that's the issue, right? Because the thing is, I think so. I always describe myself as a neoclassical economist with an asterisk, and the asterisk is some of the Austrian parts, right? Because one thing I think neoclassical economics overplayed their hand, right, is static economic analysis, which for viewers who don't know this, it's the graphs we draw. Because what happens is even if the model may seem necessarily bad and oversimplified, the honest truth is it happens to be a good representation of the long run condition that will come about, right? And so when it comes to the dynamic models, right, when we bring dynamism into that, all we're doing is taking that static model and adding some flavor to it, showing how we reach that state, right? And I think neoclassical economists, their great mistake is by drawing these static models, they often assume that that's just the case. There's no time involved in the model. And I think that's a real problem I have, which leads many economists to assume that if it's not perfect competition in a given market, right, at any given moment in time, we must have the government step in, right? And I think that's a deeply ignorant view that just assumes time away, right? Because while something's not a perfect competition in any one moment in time, that doesn't tell you anything about the long run trend. One dot is not a trend.
Yes. So you cut out a little bit on the internet, but I think the summary of that was perfect in the fact that, neoclassical draw like this really simple relationship, like if A, then B. But then, when you're adding the dynamics into this as time changes, they become more complex and dynamic. And it ties back into a lot of the utility pieces we're talking about. I talk a lot about trends with things. Like when I was a kid, Beanie Babies and Pokemon were huge. And of course, if you would have been drawing trends and doing these simple relationships, you'd have been like, all right, put your life savings in Pokemon cards and Beanie Babies, and you'll be a millionaire by the time you retire. And yet we all know theoretically it's going to come back down. The data doesn't tell me that. But you have to use theory to be safe. I'm a logical person. This is a cool game for my kids. I'll buy them a few things, but this isn't going to be my, life savings here.
Yeah, that's why I try to kind of draw a balance between if it doesn't meet the evidence, you have to change it. But on another hand, if you see a single data point that varies from your theory, that doesn't invalidate the theory, right? Because especially with economics, it's long run, right? We're dealing with the long run. Anything can happen in the short run. And the reason we do that is not because we're lazy. It's because in the short run, there's often too many variables to account for. And we just can't tell you what's going to happen in any instance. What we say is that there's a tendency that certain conditions will prevail over the long run, and that for as long as that tendency is not obstructed, it will tend to be the case. And while that seems like overly general and it seems like we're kind of almost ignoring the honest truth behind it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reality that we have to cope with is that we can't get anything better yet. We can't build models that perfectly predict every single state of the economy, nor do I think we'll ever be able to, because things are too complex, right? But that doesn't mean we should just kind of abandon these sort of trends when we see them not accounting for, right? And I think the great flaw in Keynesian economics, to bring it back to this, right, is that they're overly focused on the short run. But the problem with focusing on the short run is nothing in economics is true in the short run. There's only a long run. And I know we always talk about like distinguishing short and long run. That is useful, right? But we don't know what's going to happen in the short run. That's the whole reason we make the distinction. And Keynesians often want to adjust the short run because in the long run, we're all dead, as Keynes famously said. And I always like to retort that, yes, in the long run, we're all dead, but in the long run, we only know if our policy worked.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where a lot of this kind of fails and falls apart with the Keynesian perspective I have, which is Keynesian makes sense if you're a Wall Street banker and you're
Yes.
making money today. But for the average American, for the policies that are going to affect not necessarily just your lifetime when you're dead, but are going to impact your kids and your grandkids, which is, I think, how most people start to think as you become older, you start to realize you need to have models that actually model these dynamics. And I love when they say, well, models are wrong. And they say, oh, the economy is different, it's deviating. It's like
Yes.
the economy itself is never wrong, right? Our model is wrong, and we know that, or there's a limitation to the model, so we know that if these things occur. But often, what the Keynesian I think failed to realize is your government intervention is what's making the fluctuations a lot of times in these markets, and you don't want to bear the consequences. Like right now, I think it's like the perfect time for economics, as we're like pumped in so much money supply. I think it's like, I don't know, it was like 5 times, right? You look at the M1 money chart and it just like blows people's minds who are not economists.
Yes.
And you go, they literally just created money out of thin air and then we distributed it to everybody. And now somehow we think like everything's going to be okay. Like nothing bad will come out of creating free value. We're just going to like make it just happen.
So when we talk about kind of economics, right? The thing that I always like to stress is this story that I tell because it's true. In my junior year of university, right, I made a bet with one of my friends. I told him we were expanding the money supply too fast and I was insane, and that I was peddling some crazy Milton Friedman conspiracy theory. And I was like, okay, you want to bet on it? And he was like, yeah, sure. So we had $100 on it. And obviously he ended up paying me those $100. And he's now converted to monetarism. So I consider that a win. And that's the story I always tell, because the thing is, your theory is determined by your predictive power, right? And he was like, oh, well, our economy has all this slack. And he went through this long explanation, which more or less amounted to, I think unemployment's too high. And what I told him is, yeah, I don't focus on unemployment. I focus on the money supply and output. And if the money supply exceeds our rate of output at any given period, we would expect there to be inflation, especially over longer time periods. And he was like, oh, I don't think that's true. And it ended up being the correct prediction, right? And just on one other point you said, I always like to distinguish that markets can be wrong. They can produce bad outcomes, right? The question is bad relative to what often? And that's the key, right? I always say markets are a pretty terrible way to deal with problems. If you're comparing it to a scenario, you have a godlike being running things, right? But once you compare your realistic alternatives, markets tend to be the least bad of alternatives. It's like the quote Winston Churchill's famous for saying, democracy is the worst system of government except for all the others that have been tried from time to time, right?
Yeah.
Capitalism is the worst system of economics except for all the others.
Yeah. Well, I think people miss too the fact of markets that markets have to correct.
Yes.
So if all of us as a whole, as a market, all market participants make bad decisions for an extended period of time, the market, like a housing bubble, becomes overinflated, which often is fed by government decisioning on top of that, which helps motivate individuals to make poor decisions. And yet you have all these poor decisions. It has to correct. Like there has to be some sort of correction within it. You can't just like, think that somehow like we're going to like be in this blissful state for eternity.
Well, that's what I always kind of bring utility functions into this, right? Because here's the usefulness of utility functions. Without them, what we can't say is we can never say a government policy is inefficient, because efficiency is directly tied to welfare. And so if we can't ever find any way of even theoretically measuring welfare, we can't at all do economics, basically. And so my contention has always been, well, if we can't distinguish between an efficient policy and an inefficient policy, economics is useless. There is no purpose to it. And so the reason we have these sort of welfare calculations, right, is then we can say, well, this policy is producing a result that we consider good at this time. Will it continue to do that, right? And the answer is generally, if you're in a well-functioning market, if it is against the demand of consumers, the answer is no, right? And so really good examples, we can keep interest rates really low for a really long time, right?
Yeah.
But that will eventually overproduce the amount of capital goods because there'll be way too much capital in the economy. And businesses will recognize that consumers don't demand that. And so they're losing money on all this stuff, and it'll force them to contract their production processes to reshift that to a more normal balance of capital and consumer goods. But that's something, if you have no welfare analysis, you can't know, because you could never know what demand is, right? And that's the key that I think most economists forget about, is they get so obsessed with metrics that they forget what underlies the metrics, why we're looking at them. And that's where theory really comes in, because if you can't interpret data and all you're looking at is statistics, you can't really have any preference or theory about what's going to happen.
Right. So as a final note here to wrap up this interview, do you want to tell us what you would do if you were just someone out there listening and you wanted to learn more about economics? Where would you go? What would you read? So first off, your book.
Yes. I would not start with reading my book. My book, this is not good marketing, I'm aware, but my book is good for macroeconomics, but you have to learn your micro first, and you have to really get into the discipline, because business cycle theory is very nebulous and hard to understand. So I would always say, first things first, probably start with something like Marginal Revolution University. That's a website run by Tyler Cohen, and I'm forgetting the other economist right now, who they will give a basic microeconomics course about, right? An alternative is just read economics books, right? And specifically focus on begin with ones that are more accessible and work your way down. So the one I always tell people to start with is Economics in One Lesson. It's not a perfect book, right? But basically high level, it gives you basic price theory, supply and demand. If you create rent control, you'll get this result, right? If you have a minimum wage, or if you overexpand credit, you'll get this result. Economics in One Lesson is a really good place to start, right? Another one to get an idea for economic analysis is Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, right? Or Free to Choose, the book, not the documentary series, even though the docuseries is also good, right? Because while those ones get a little into politics, and you don't have to agree with Milton Friedman's politics to appreciate them, they fundamentally give you a lot of good principles of economic analysis, which is why even economists who tend towards the left recommend you read these books, right? And then kind of work your way to more fundamental texts, right? So maybe David Friedman, Milton Friedman's son's textbook on price theory, or Alfred Marshall's Principles of Economics, or The Wealth of Nations, right? Because I think what many economists who want to kind of get into the subject, or many aspiring economists, right, is that they start with the very complex works. They go, this is too dense, this is too hard to understand, I give up, right? And I would rather people start with works that are a little too oversimplified, a little too lacking in nuance, and then work their way to the more complex stuff, than start at the complex stuff and give up. So that's why I always kind of say start with Economics in One Lesson, and kind of work your way towards books that are less focused on very specific policies meant for more popular audience, to the more fundamental texts that we work with.
Awesome. That is great advice. I think it is critical for everyone to kind of take that advice of, start with the simple things and work your way down, but also, thinking through these ideas. Because I think a lot of people get tracked into one of these groups, like I must read only, classical, or I must read only Keynesian. I often read Keynesian as well, just to get my understanding, and then I can think about how they work within the frameworks and think like, does this really make sense in practice? And it kind of helps you build out more of a robust framework around that.
Yeah. And one other thing on that, right? And I think this is good for just general education, right? I used to be a mainstream economist, the alternative to mainline, right? I was a hardcore Keynesian, very expressly injected my political views into my economics. I was very focused on, government must do the right thing if it intervenes, and I'll just assume that to be true. And I was very against mainline economics, right? That was my norm. And people can tell you a few of my friends have like discussions that we've had still hidden somewhere as like revenge or something, which is like all these views that I express that now I'm embarrassed of, I used to express at one point. And the reason is I only read economics that agreed with my viewpoint, right? I read Keynes, I read, Joseph Stiglitz, I read Paul Krugman, right? And I kind of only focused on things that agreed with me. And my friend, who I met at the time, I made a friend maybe a few weeks into my sophomore year, and he kind of said, why do you only read things that agree with you? And he started debating me on these topics, and it made me start to question, am I right? Because I was so convinced that to me, it seemed reasonable that I was right. And to me, that seemed like the right answer. And once he started challenging me, I got into reading the very economists that I said, oh, well, these are not reputable economists anymore. We've evolved beyond that, right? And I began kind of developing a respect for the neoclassical and Austrian tradition that are often dismissed by many who have a political agenda, right? And in that, you kind of learn what the correct answer is. And I'm not even saying I'm correct, right? There's a high probability I get at least some things wrong, right? But you need to kind of constantly learn and challenge yourself by reading things you disagree with. And only through that, you can find truth. It's not by only reading things that are on your side of this aisle, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's an excellent perspective. Well, Ciara, it was great having you on. Thanks for coming to the podcast.
Thank you.